This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, China's top trade negotiator is traveling to Washington this week as tension over trade intensifies between the two nations. President Trump is threatening to impose a 25% tariff on nearly all Chinese imports after the U.S. accused China of backtracking on trade commitments. Talks are expected to resume Thursday, but the Trump administration is facing criticism for refusing to address China's human rights record as part of those negotiations.
The United Nations and a number of human rights groups have accused the Chinese government of setting up massive camps in the far west Xinjiang province to hold an unknown number of ethnic Uyghurs and other Muslims. Estimates of the population of the camps range from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million, perhaps millions. China says the camps have been built as re-education and training centers and are needed to combat extremism in the region. The New York Times reports the Trump administration has shelved proposed targeted sanctions over the mass detentions out of fear it could derail a potential trade deal. Last week, Human Rights Watch revealed new details about how China is carrying out massive surveillance in Xinjiang, as in part thanks to a mobile app that lets authorities monitor the Muslim population. This video, produced by Human Rights Watch, begins with a Uyghur student.
I used to be one of those people, like, I got nothing to hide, I'm just a student, but I was very wrong. They're targeting everyone. As long as you're going out of your house, you're being surveilled.
In Xinjiang, in northwestern China, 13 million Turkic Muslims are already enduring extraordinary suppression at the hands of the Chinese government. And authorities there are building a surveillance state to be able to track their every move.
Across the northwestern province of Xinjiang, an estimated 1 million Chinese Muslims have vanished into a vast network of detention centers for what China calls re-education.
The region is now under what's probably the most intense government surveillance in the world.
Every 200 meters would have a police checkpoint. And then on top of that, there are all these checkpoints at public places wherever you go. If you're Uyghur, they stop you. They would just say, "Where's your ID? I want to check your ID." They would punch in the ID number and then they would see everything about you.
One tool at the heart of Xinjiang's surveillance system is the IJOP, or the Integrated Joint Operations Platform. The IJOP has an app that's used by police and government officials to track extraordinary amounts of personal information about individuals, ranging from their religious habits to their blood type. The information from the app feeds into a central system and combines with information from other surveillance systems, including CCTV cameras that rely on facial recognition software, and even Wi-Fi sniffers that are used as people walk through checkpoints to pull information off their phones. The IJOP system aggregates all this data about people, flags those it deems suspicious, and sends alerts to nearby officials. These dubious criteria are being used to identify large numbers of people, many of whom are then arbitrarily locked up.
That's a video produced by Human Rights Watch. We're joined now by two guests. Sophie Richardson is China Director for Human Rights Watch. She appears in that video. She edited the new report, China's Algorithms of Repression, Reverse Engineering a Xinjiang Police Mass Surveillance App. We're also joined by Uyghur-American activist Rushan Abbas. She's the founder and director of Campaign for Uyghurs. After she spoke out against China's repression of the Uyghurs last year, her aunt and sister disappeared. Their aunt has since been released, but there's still no news of her sister. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Sophie Richardson, explain further exactly first who made this app and how China is using this, particularly against the Muslim Uyghur population.
The app itself was designed by a company called Hebei Far East Technology Corporation, which was at the time a subsidiary of a very large Chinese conglomerate called CETC. And the goal really was to build a system broadly that could integrate multiple different streams of data from everything, from police-used apps to facial recognition software. And then this particular app was designed for police to use on their mobile devices, both to gather information about people, but then to receive directives from the central system about whether they were meant to go out and carry out further investigations of people and what sorts of information they were meant to gather.
And Rushan, Abbas, could you talk about the Pentagon is estimating that perhaps as many as 3 million Uyghurs are in concentration camps in China. Could you talk about the current level of the repression, whether it has been increasing or what the status, from what you know of the people of your group?
The Chinese government is getting away with this mass atrocity. And what they are doing today is increasing, actually, because they are being able to cover up. They are being able to manipulate the information with the information blockade. They are being able to increase the numbers, as you see. Back in December, it was 800 to about 2 million, the estimation. Now it's more than 3 million. My sister is still being incarcerated somewhere that we don't know. I am just one example of millions of the other innocent Uyghur people being held. The Uyghur Muslims are being a collateral damage between communist China's hunger for power and the other countries' trade deals.
I wanted to ask Sophie Richardson, when it comes to the Uyghur population, what does China explain that it is doing? And how does it justify this app? How much is known about this app, for example, inside China?
Well, the Chinese government's broad justification for its policies in Xinjiang really revolve around national security. The Chinese government insists that it's grappling with threats of terrorism, and that since it began its latest Strike Hard Against Extremism campaign in 2016, there have been no major attacks. Now, we would respond to that by saying there have been no major attacks since the province is under a near total lockdown, regardless of whether someone is detained in a political education camp or outside, where there are still pervasive restrictions on movement, religion, people interacting with one another. You know, the app is certainly, it seems, reasonably well known across the province. We had come across it in the course of doing research on other kinds of surveillance technology, but then we found more discussions on police-run WeChat accounts, and then actually had interviewees who had been released from political education camps describe to us that when they were detained, police were gathering information and entering it into this app and then making decisions that those people should be subject to further detention. And then we actually found the app, which at the time was publicly available, and downloaded it and set to work reverse engineering it to show, you know, dozens of different kinds of behavior, all of them perfectly legal, that are now considered essentially evidence of problematic or suspicious behavior by the authorities.
And you mentioned that even such an otherwise normal act as going outside the back door of your house as opposed to the front door of your house could be a trigger for the Chinese authorities to gather information on these apps?
Yeah, some of the behaviors described or logged are really ludicrous. Front door versus back door. If you're suddenly talking to your neighbor more or less, if facial recognition software logs you putting gas into a car that doesn't belong to you. You know, these are all behaviors that are perfectly legal under Chinese law, and yet they're now considered grounds for investigation and, in some cases, arbitrary detention.
I want to turn to Al Jazeera's Mehdi Hassan, who recently interviewed the Chinese professor Charles Liu, who works as an informal advisor to the Chinese government.
Your country, the government you support and have advised, according to a UN rapporteur, according to the US State Department, according to Amnesty International, according to Human Rights Watch, according to plenty of journalists and many others, are believed to have detained maybe 1 million people or more, mainly from the Uyghur Muslim ethnic minority, in re-education camps. 1 million people, Charles. Okay. 1 million.
Okay. It's certainly not grabbing headlines in China.
Isn't that because you don't have a free press in China, so you can't have headlines about the Uyghurs?
No, it's because there are 55 national minorities in China, and Uyghurs' population is, in total,
9 and 10 million, I believe, in Xinjiang.
yes, 0.7%.
Okay, but the world doesn't work on percentages. If you lock up a million
The
people
world
in camps,
doesn't-
the world pays attention.
1.4 billion people need to be fed, need to be clothed,
I've got to
need to
lock
be
up a million
educated.
people in Xinjiang. That must concern you to hear that a million people of your fellow Chinese countrymen and women have been locked
If
up
it's
by your
true,
government.
sure.
How do we establish if it's true or not? Why don't you let people in to check and count? Then we'll know for sure.
I think people have visited.
No, they've been on kind of supervised trips with Chinese monitors to select camps where they haven't been able to see everything. In fact, Reuters went on a trip last year. They were taken around. They were allowed to meet some people, and the people sang, "If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands."
That's Mehdi Hassan at the Oxford Union in Britain, along with the Chinese professor Liu. Rushan Abbas, you are Uyghur. You're a Uyghur-American activist. Your sister still disappeared. Your response?
Well, since April 2017, all the Uyghurs in diaspora, they are unable to contact their family members. Currently, the Chinese government arranged another supervised tour to selected camps in Kashgar and the other parts. And the authorities told the reporters they are here voluntarily and they're being able to return home over the weekends. That's not in reality. The people disappeared for more than 2-3 years now. Nobody knows where they are. They are not coming home. They are not in contact with their family members. My sister, Dr. Gulshan Abbas, she's a medical doctor. She doesn't need vocational training. She doesn't need to be taught Chinese. She speaks fluent Mandarin Chinese. My sister is just one example of hundreds and hundreds of the Uyghur intellectuals, more than 400 numbers that are being reported, being incarcerated now. The university presidents, professors, famous writers, they are all taken and nobody knows where they are. They are not there voluntarily, as the Chinese government is announcing to the world or showing the other reporters, as Mehdi Hassan mentioned, in supervised tours.
And Rushan Abbas, could you talk about the China's Belt and Road Initiative and its relationship to the strategic location of Xinjiang province in terms of that that well-known effort by China to build trade ties across the world?
Since the Chinese Communist government's occupation of the Uyghur homeland in 1949, the Chinese government relentlessly tried to eliminate the Uyghur culture and the ethnicity and the religion being targeted under the different labels. But recently, last 2-3 years, the deterioration of the human rights abuse in this massive scale is directly connected to the Belt and Road Initiative. The Uyghur homeland lies on the strategic heart of Belt and Road Initiative, and it's a gateway to the Central Asia, to Europe, to Africa. Therefore, the Xi Jinping's signature project to the world domination, and the innocent Uyghur people are becoming the victims.
And let me just quickly ask Sophie Richardson, why the discrepancy in number? I mean, this is a large discrepancy to say between 1 and 3 million Uyghurs are being held. Why don't we know?
Well, we don't know because the Chinese government is lying. Even, for the first 6 months that groups like mine were documenting this phenomenon, the Chinese government was denying that these camps or facilities even existed. They then changed their tune and said that they did exist, but that they were vocational training schools or boarding schools. And we've argued hard that the only way to really ascertain the truth is for the Chinese government to allow in independent international inspectors who can visit the facilities freely and talk to people without fear of reprisal to get a sense of just how many people are detained and to argue hard that they should be immediately released.
I just want to let people know, for people who are reading about this, Uyghur is spelled Uyghur. That's Uyghur. We're joined also by Li Fang, investigative journalist with The Intercept, to look at the unexpected investor in Chinese surveillance, Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden. Fang's most recent article is headlined, Chinese fund backed by Hunter Biden invested in technology used to surveil Muslims. Lee, thanks for joining us again on Democracy Now! Explain what you learned.
Amy, thanks for having me. China's sprawling police state relies heavily on a high-tech security apparatus to monitor, track, and incarcerate those viewed as a threat to the Chinese state. That's dissidents, activists, journalists, and increasingly the entire Uyghur Muslim population in Western China. And a key component of this security apparatus is the collection of biometric data. This biometric data collection comes from a number of private sector firms. One of the major Chinese startups involved in this biometric data collection is a company called Face++. This is a facial recognition software company, a Chinese company. It provided a key license to the app that Sophie has explained, and it's also used in security cameras all over the country. Now, in the last week, we've seen a number of Western reports scrutinizing the Chinese investors that stand to profit that have invested in Face++. But in our story on Friday, we revealed that there are a number of American investors that also stand to profit from this mass surveillance that are also invested in Face++, one of whom is Hunter Biden, the son of former Vice President Joe Biden.
And Lee, how exactly did and when did Hunter Biden form his Chinese investment company, Bohai Harvest RST? How did that come about?
Well, over the last 10 years, Hunter Biden has been involved in a number of investment opportunities and business deals. You know, in 2008, he deregistered as a lobbyist and transitioned into this investment career. In 2014, he traveled to China and formed this very exclusive investor partnership with the Chinese government, partnering with the Bank of China, that's one of the largest state-owned banks. And in 2017, Hunter Biden and his company, Bohai Harvest RST, participated in the C-Series investment round in Face++, helping the company raise over $400 million, bringing its valuation to currently over $3 billion. So he's far from a passive investor. In fact, this business deal shows that he's been given really exclusive access to investing in some of China's most largest technology companies, and he certainly stands to benefit as this company continues to grow.
There are Democrats who've pointed out that this issue of Hunter Biden, Joe Biden, the presidential candidate's son, is being pushed by the Daily Caller and Fox to discredit Biden. Your response, Li Fang?
Well, look, the tactic by special interests, both domestic and foreign, to put politicians on the payroll of any interest group seeking influence over a powerful politician is a bipartisan issue. It's not a right-wing issue or a left-wing issue. I can go through a laundry list of Democrats and Republicans in Congress who have had family members, sons and daughters or spouses that were added to lobbying firms or corporations to peddle influence. And this dynamic extends certainly to the White House as well. The Trump sons, including Don Jr., have received exclusive licensing agreements and permits to expand Trump hotels in Indonesia and in India and so on. Ivanka has received special licenses to sell her products in China. We see this dynamic and this criticism in addition to the Biden family coming from folks from across the ideological spectrum. And it's not particular to the China issue. In 2003, one of the most controversial votes that Joe Biden took, he joined with Republicans to pass the 2003 bankruptcy bill. At the time, one of the largest credit card issuers in the country was MBNA, which was lobbying for that legislation. MBNA hired Hunter Biden as a consultant at a time when they were lobbying for Joe Biden to pass that law. In 2014, when Joe Biden was engaged in high-stakes negotiations in Ukraine, at a time at the height of Russian aggression in that region, Hunter Biden was hired and placed on the board of a major Ukrainian fracking company, paid as much as $50,000 a month. And now with this China issue, we're seeing a lot of criticism of Joe Biden and his son because, again, Hunter Biden gained exclusive access to this very unusual investment deal with the Chinese state at a time when Joe Biden was leading negotiations, traveling between Beijing and Washington, D.C. as the vice president. And it will pose serious conflicts of interest as Joe Biden seeks the presidential nomination.
That's one thing, I wanted to ask you about, because clearly this would, to some critics of the corporate wing of the Democratic Party, this will definitely give them cause to raise that this is a repetition of the Clinton family's corruption issues over their dealings with foreign governments as well.
Well, that certainly may be a political issue, but it is also a genuine policy concern for any observer or any critic of U.S.-China relations. And look, it's not exclusive to the Biden family. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, was once a big critic of China policy, of China human rights. Later, he became a big proponent of trade relations with China and kind of ended his very vocal criticism of China. Later, actually after the 2016 election, Mitch McConnell's sister-in-law, Angela Chow, was added to the board of Bank of China. There are many instances, both Republican and Democrat, where China has attempted to seek influence with powerful policy figures. Joe Biden, I should note, has long been a friend of China. In 2000, when there was a major vote about permanent normal trade relations with China, Joe Biden rallied Democratic support, and he basically argued that China does not pose an economic threat to the U.S., that China at the time, this was in the year 2000, had the economy of the size of the Netherlands, and that China would never pose a threat to American manufacturing. So Joe Biden has been a friend of China for a very long time, and it appears China's been very friendly to the Joe Biden family as well.
Sophie Richardson, I wanted to ask you about this foreign policy article that was out in March, headlined, U.S. Firms Are Helping Build China's Orwellian State. Can you talk about this and how this relates to the mass surveillance, particularly of the Muslim community in China?
Sure. Just picking up on one of Lee's points, I think American companies and funds and portfolios of investments that are engaged with Chinese surveillance companies need to stop right now and have a long, close look at what exactly they're invested in, where that's they actually want to be putting money. But we looked at one particular company, a Massachusetts-based medical technology firm called Thermo Fisher Scientific, which we found to be selling DNA sequencers to the Xinjiang Public Security Bureau, for which they had the right export licenses. Let's be clear about that. But they were doing so at a time when we were documenting the Xinjiang authorities imposing compulsory collection of DNA samples from everyone across the region between the ages of 12 and 65 under the guise of a free public health care program. And we went to this company several times and said, what's your due diligence strategy to make sure that your sales and operations aren't contributing to human rights violations? And they never really answered that question. Members of Congress asked them, and finally the New York Times wrote about their activities, at which point the company said, we've decided to stop selling this particular technology in that particular region. But we don't know what they continue to sell to other parts of the country. And the reality is we still aren't any clearer about what strategies they have in place to answer that due diligence question. And I think that applies equally to any company, American, European, Australian, anyone's companies that are doing business in a region that's been labeled by UN experts as a rights-free zone.
I want to ask you about a separate China-related issue. Last week, tens of thousands of people in Hong Kong marched peacefully against a proposal that would allow people in Hong Kong to be extradited to China for trial, where they'd obviously face fewer protections than in Hong Kong, which has long operated under the one country, two systems mantra. Could you talk about that and your concerns about that?
Sure. I think if this agreement goes ahead, we've gone really from one country, two systems to one country, one system, because it would effectively gut some of the protections that have long been available to people in Hong Kong, but not in the rest of mainland China if they are to be extradited. There are all sorts of ramifications for knowing the evidence against you and having access to counsel. And it's been seen widely in Hong Kong in the last couple of weeks as a serious encroachment on, particularly on Hong Kong's judicial independence and integrity. And that's an institution in Hong Kong that has always stood the territory apart from the rest of the mainland. And if it loses that kind of authority and integrity, it really is seen as Hong Kong just becoming another part of the mainland.
And finally, on this trade negotiations that's taking place this week, Sophie, President Trump announcing plans to increase tariffs $200 billion from 10 to 25%, also threatening to impose new tariffs on another $325 billion of Chinese products. Your thoughts about this move regarding trade with China? And just as the Trump administration says they will not impose any kind of sanctions related to what we are talking about.
Well, we don't particularly have a view on things like tariffs. We have a lot of views on the use of sanctions, and particularly the global Magnitsky sanctions, which are meant to be imposed on individuals or entities that are credibly alleged to have been involved in serious human rights violations. And so people like the current Xinjiang party secretary, Chen Chuanguo, would clearly be a target for precisely these kinds of sanctions. And especially given Secretary Pompeo's and other administration officials' willingness to be publicly very critical of China's actions in Xinjiang, the fact that the administration is not going ahead with these kinds of sanctions is not just giving China a free pass and enabling it, it's really undercutting the very purpose of those sanctions at all. And so, it's also worth pointing out that this is an administration that doesn't seem to have trouble sanctioning lots of different people and companies for different kinds of behavior. And so the unwillingness on this particular matter is seriously problematic and really effectively is saying to the Chinese government, do what you want in Xinjiang, and saying to Uyghurs, we're not actually really concerned about what's happening to you or your family members.
Well, Sophie Richardson, I want to thank you very much for being with us, China Director for Human Rights Watch. We're going to link to your whole comprehensive report. And Li Fang, investigative journalist at The Intercept. Thanks also to Rushan Abbas, who is the Uyghur-American activist. When we come back, we look at Republican efforts to suppress the vote in Florida with voting rights activist Desmond Meade. Back in 30 seconds.